The notification came through at 2300 hours on a Tuesday, just as Daniel Casper was settling in with his third cup of coffee and a translation contract involving Tholian commercial law. His apartment in New Seattle was small but comfortable, filled with the accumulated debris of someone who lived alone and didn't see the point in impressing visitors he rarely had. Books in 6 languages lined shelves built from recycled station materials. His work terminal occupied the corner that got the best natural light, and his kitchen was optimized for efficiency rather than aesthetics. He wasn't expecting the door chime. His few friends knew better than to visit unannounced at nearly midnight, and delivery services stopped running hours ago. When he opened the door, his brain took several long seconds to process what he was seeing. Saralith, from Academy, 15 years ago, standing in his hallway looking simultaneously exactly as he remembered and completely different. She was Velkari, with the elegant features and silver markings that traced delicate patterns across her skin. Her long ears, currently pressed flat against her skull, in an expression his rusty memory of Velkari body language told him meant fear or extreme stress, framed a face he'd watched from across lecture halls and dining facilities for 4 years without ever having the courage to approach. "Daniel Casper," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, melodic, precise, now edged with desperation. "I need your help, please." Daniel's social skills, never his strong suit, completely failed him. He stared at her for what felt like an eternity before his brain caught up with the situation. "Saralith, from Academy, how did you? What are you doing on Earth? May I come in?" She glanced down the hallway like she expected pursuit. "I'll explain everything, but not out here." He stepped aside, his apartment suddenly feeling even smaller and more inadequate with her presence in it. She moved inside with the natural grace all Velkari seemed to possess, and Daniel found himself acutely aware of the dishes in his sink, the laundry draped over his desk chair, the general chaos of a life lived without expectation of witnesses. "Can I get you something? I have coffee, water, some kind of juice that might be past its date." He trailed off, recognizing he was babbling from pure nervous energy. Water would be kind. She sat on his couch, the only furniture besides his desk chair and bed, and looked at him with those amber eyes he remembered from shared xenobiology lectures. "Thank you for letting me in. I know this is strange. We barely knew each other at Academy." "We didn't really know each other at all," Daniel corrected, getting her water from his small kitchen and trying not to think about how surreal this was. "We shared some classes, but I don't think we ever actually had a conversation." He didn't add that he'd been intensely aware of her presence during those shared classes, that he'd noticed the way her markings brightened when she understood complex concepts, that he'd watched her laugh with friends in the cafeteria while he ate alone, and wished he had the social confidence to approach her. She'd been everything he wasn't: connected, confident, naturally brilliant in ways that made Academy challenges look effortless. "I noticed you more than you might think," Saralith said quietly, accepting the water. "But that's not why I'm here. Daniel, I'm in serious trouble, and I need help from someone outside normal channels. Someone who won't be monitored or expected. Someone with very specific skills in xenolinguistics and pattern recognition." "Okay," Daniel said slowly, sitting in his desk chair because sharing the couch felt too intimate given that they were essentially strangers. "Why don't you start from the beginning?" What followed was an explanation that sounded like something from a political thriller. Saralith worked as a mid-level diplomat in the Velkari Foreign Ministry, focusing on trade negotiations and cultural exchange programs. 3 months ago, while preparing briefing materials for her superiors, she'd stumbled across communication patterns that seemed wrong. Messages that referenced meetings that hadn't been scheduled, resource allocations that didn't match official budgets, coded language that her diplomatic training told her indicated covert operations. She'd investigated quietly, using her security clearances to access communications between various departments. What she found was evidence of a conspiracy reaching through multiple levels of Velkari government and extending into human and Krethian political structures. The conspiracy was planning to sabotage the upcoming Concordance Summit, a critical gathering where dozens of species would negotiate new treaties regarding resource rights in disputed space. But it's not just sabotage, Sarilith explained, her markings dim with stress. The plan is designed to trigger conflict specifically between humanity and the Krethian alliance, create an incident that looks like human aggression, ensure Krethian retaliation, and let the two powers escalate into open warfare. In the chaos, the conspirators consolidate control over resource extraction operations worth trillions of credits. Daniel tried to process this, and you tried to report this. To my immediate superior, who dismissed it as paranoia. To internal security, who suspended my clearances pending investigation. To a trusted mentor who... Her ears pressed even flatter. Who I discovered was part of the conspiracy. Within 48 hours of my report, I was placed under protective observation in my quarters. Essentially house arrest while they determined how much I knew and who I'd told. How did you escape? I have friends from Academy who owe me favors, and who could arrange transport off Velkari space before anyone thought to revoke my travel authorizations. I came to Earth because the conspiracy won't be monitoring lower-level human resources like linguistic consultants. I need someone who can help me decrypt communications I managed to copy, someone who can find patterns in multilingual coded messages that automated systems miss. Someone brilliant at exactly the kind of detailed linguistic analysis that humans excel at. She looked at Daniel with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. I need you. Daniel stood up and paced the small space of his apartment, his mind racing through all the ways this was a terrible idea. He was a translator. He worked contract jobs from his apartment, lived a quiet life that didn't involve conspiracies or interstellar politics. He'd spent his entire academy career trying to be invisible, and now someone was asking him to potentially prevent a war. Sarilith, I'm nobody. I'm not a spy or an investigator or anything useful for what you're describing. I translate commercial contracts and occasionally help with academic papers. That's it. You're exactly who I need, she countered. You have expertise in xenolinguistic pattern recognition that most people don't even know exists as a specialty. You're human, which means you're below the conspiracy's radar. They're watching for major intelligence operatives and political figures, not consultants in New Seattle. And she hesitated, her markings flickering with something he couldn't identify. I trust you. You don't know me well enough to trust me. I know you better than you think. Her voice was soft now, almost vulnerable. I watched you at Academy, Daniel. You think no one noticed you, but I did. You helped a Tholian student with chemistry when everyone else ignored them because they were struggling. You stayed late in biology labs double-checking your work because you couldn't rely on natural ability like the rest of us. During our final year, when that fight broke out between Krethian and human students, you stepped between them even though you were clearly terrified, and you talked them down using nothing but empathy and common ground. Daniel stared at her, completely blindsided. You remember that? I remember thinking that you were braver than anyone else in that hall, because everyone else had powers or size or confidence to fall back on. You had nothing except conviction that the fight was wrong and needed stopping. That's courage, Daniel, real courage. And that's why I'm here, because I need someone who's genuinely good, who will do the right thing even when it's terrifying. The conspiracy is filled with brilliant, powerful people who have chosen expediency over ethics. I need someone who chooses differently. Daniel sat back down, his legs suddenly unreliable. You're asking me to risk my life, to go up against people connected enough to compromise multiple governments. I'm not equipped for that. No one is equipped for this, but someone has to try. She leaned forward. If the summit sabotage succeeds, if humans and Crethians go to war, thousands die minimum, probably millions. And it happens because people like me, who knew something was wrong, were either too compromised or too scared to act. I'm asking you to be the person who acts anyway. Daniel thought about his quiet life, his modest apartment, his comfortable certainty that he wasn't special enough to matter in the vast machinery of interstellar politics. He thought about being invisible at Academy, about eating alone, about all the ways he'd learned to accept that he was just okay at everything and exceptional at nothing. Then he thought about what Saralith had said. That she'd noticed him, that she'd watched him help others, that she remembered moments he'd assumed no one saw. "Show me what you have," he said finally. "If I can actually help decrypt these communications, I'll try. But I'm not promising miracles." Relief washed across her face, her markings brightening slightly. "Thank you." They worked through the night. Daniel at his terminal with Saralith sitting beside him, explaining the political context of the communications she'd managed to copy before escaping Velkari space. The messages were in multiple languages: Velkari, Standard, Crethian, even some dialects that Daniel's translation software struggled with. They used codes and false cognates, embedded meanings in grammatical structures that automated systems would miss. But Daniel had spent years learning languages the hard way, without the natural advantages other species possessed. He'd learned to notice tiny variations in grammar and syntax because he couldn't rely on intuitive understanding the way native speakers could. He approached language like a puzzle, finding patterns that others missed because they never had to look that closely. 4 hours in, he started seeing connections. "This phrase here," he pointed at a section of text, "it uses an archaic Velkari grammatical construction that's technically correct but no one uses anymore. Except it appears in 3 other messages with similar content. That's not coincidence. That's a marker to identify messages from a particular source." Saralith leaned in to look, and Daniel was suddenly very aware of her proximity. "Can you trace it?" "Maybe, if we cross-reference with the message timestamps and routing data." He pulled up additional files, started correlating timestamps with linguistic markers. Slowly, patterns emerged. Not dramatic revelations, but subtle connections between communications that suggested coordination. By dawn, they'd identified at least 15 individuals involved in the conspiracy based purely on linguistic analysis. The way they structured certain phrases, the specific dialects they used, the grammatical markers that identified them across supposedly anonymous communications. Daniel sat back from his terminal, exhausted and wired simultaneously. "This is real. This conspiracy, it's really happening." "Yes," Saralith said, "and we've just provided the first hard evidence of its scope, but we need more. We need to prove the connection to the summit sabotage, and we need to do it in a way that can't be dismissed or buried. The authorities would dismiss a disgraced Velkari diplomat and a human consultant as either paranoid or involved in some rival conspiracy. We need irrefutable proof, exposed publicly where it can't be suppressed." She looked at him. "The primary communication hub for this sector is on Titan, near the Academy. If we can access their servers, we can pull the complete communication records that prove the conspiracy. But it requires physical access. Their security prevents remote extraction." Daniel processed this. "You want us to go back to Titan. I want us to finish what we started, together." She reached out and took his hand, a gesture that felt intimate and terrifying and right all at once. "Daniel, I know I'm asking too much. But I can't do this alone." He thought about the scared student he'd been at Academy, always feeling like he didn't belong, always convinced he wasn't enough. He thought about spending 15 years in quiet obscurity, convinced that was his natural place. Then he thought about Saralith saying she'd noticed him, that she'd watched him be brave when he felt weakest. "Okay," he said, "let's go prevent a war." Her markings brightened to nearly full luminescence, joy and relief, and something deeper he didn't have experience recognizing. "Thank you," she said, "for believing me, for helping, for being exactly who I hoped you'd be." They booked passage on a commercial transport to Titan, and Daniel spent the 3-day journey wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into, and why some part of him felt more alive than he had in 15 years. The transport to Titan was a standard commercial vessel, comfortable enough for the 3-day journey, but nothing like the luxury shuttles diplomats usually traveled on. Saralith adapted without complaint, though Daniel noticed her checking the passenger manifest repeatedly during the first day, her ears twitching with anxiety every time someone walked past their cabin. "You think they're tracking you?" Daniel asked during their second evening, sharing a meal in the ship's small dining area. The food was standard protein synthesizers fare, edible but forgettable, and somehow that mundane reality made the entire situation feel more surreal. "I think the conspiracy has resources I can only guess at," Saralith said, pushing her food around her plate. "But honestly, if they knew where I was, we'd likely already know. They wouldn't wait politely for us to reach our destination." "That's comforting." She smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of humor Daniel had seen since she appeared at his door. "I've forgotten you humans use sarcasm as a coping mechanism. We use sarcasm for everything. It's basically our primary language." He took a bite of something that was allegedly chicken. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "At Academy you said you noticed me, but we never talked. Why?" Saralith was quiet for a moment, her markings dimming slightly. "Because I was a coward. I was more concerned with maintaining my social position than acting on what I knew was right. You were kind to people others ignored. You worked harder than anyone because you had to. You showed courage in small ways that I recognized mattered more than the flashy heroics people praised. And I wanted to approach you, to tell you I saw that. But I was too worried about what my friends would think, about whether associating with someone perceived as lesser would damage my standing." She met his eyes directly. "I've regretted that for 15 years. Regretted being the kind of person who noticed something good and chose not to engage with it because I was too concerned with appearances. When I needed help, when I needed someone I could trust who wouldn't be compromised by the systems I was part of, I thought of you. The person I should have had the courage to be friends with and wasn't." Daniel processed this, his chest tight with complicated emotions. "I spent those 4 years convinced I was invisible, that I didn't matter to anyone. You were never invisible to me. I just wasn't brave enough to let you know I saw you." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of 15 years of missed connection between them. "Well," Daniel said finally, "we're talking now. Bit of an extreme meet cute, but better late than never." Saralith's ears tilted forward, amusement. Meet cute. Human term. When potential romantic partners meet in unusual or entertaining circumstances. Though I guess, trying to prevent interstellar war might be pushing the definition a bit. "You consider us potential romantic partners." There was something in her voice, not mockery, but genuine curiosity mixed with something that might have been hope. Daniel felt his face heat. "I mean, I don't want to assume anything, I just meant." "Daniel," she reached across the table and took his hand. "I've been aware of you for 15 years. I've regretted not approaching you for 15 years. Now we're working together on something terrifying and crucial, and I'm discovering that you're everything I remembered and more: thoughtful, brilliant in ways that don't announce themselves, and genuinely kind even when it costs you. So yes, I'm considering possibilities, but first we prevent a war." "Right, war prevention. Then potentially awkward romantic navigation between species, priorities." But Daniel didn't let go of her hand, and Saralith didn't pull away. The rest of the journey passed in a strange combination of tense planning and unexpected ease. They reviewed everything they knew about the conspiracy, identifying key communication nodes and potential access points on Titan. Saralith used her diplomatic training to map out contingencies, while Daniel focused on the technical aspects of extracting data without triggering security protocols. But between the planning sessions, they talked, really talked, in ways they never had at Academy. Daniel learned that Sarilith had grown up under immense family pressure, her entire life path predetermined by her family's political connections. She'd chosen diplomatic service not out of passion, but because it was expected, and spent years performing the role of perfect Velkari diplomat while feeling increasingly hollow. "I was good at it," she admitted. "I excelled at reading political situations, at saying the right things to the right people. But I never felt like I was actually doing anything that mattered, just maintaining systems that benefited people already in power." "Is that why you investigated the conspiracy?" Daniel asked. "Because you finally found something that mattered?" "Partly, but also because I was tired of being complicit. I'd spent so many years looking the other way, accepting that politics was just manipulation and power games. When I found evidence of something genuinely evil, I couldn't ignore it. Maybe that was my subconscious trying to make up for ignoring you at Academy, seeing something wrong and finally choosing. You graduated from one of the most elite institutions in known space, competing against species with biological advantages you'll never have. That's extraordinary, Daniel. You just defined success by other people's standards instead of your own." It was a perspective Daniel had never considered, and it sat uncomfortably in his mind. The possibility that he'd spent 15 years undervaluing himself based on metrics designed for beings fundamentally different from him. They arrived at Titan on the morning of the third day. The sight of the moon brought a wash of complicated nostalgia, the Academy's crystalline structures rising above the manufactured atmosphere, the civic complex where Daniel had spent countless hours in public libraries avoiding social situations, the transport hubs he'd navigated while feeling perpetually out of place. "Strange to be back," Daniel murmured as their shuttle descended toward the civilian port. "Strange to be back together," Sarilith corrected. "We walked these same spaces for 4 years and never actually shared them. Now we're returning to potentially save lives using skills we developed here." Her markings pulsed with something complex, nostalgia mixed with determination. "There's poetry in that." They disembarked with minimal fuss, just 2 travelers among hundreds arriving daily. The communication hub they needed to access was in Titan's administrative district, disguised as a standard data processing center, but actually serving as a major routing station for classified diplomatic channels throughout the sector. Sarilith's stolen access codes, obtained during her initial investigation before everything collapsed, would theoretically get them inside. But theoretically was doing a lot of work in that sentence. They checked into a modest hotel using Daniel's credentials, less likely to trigger alerts than Sarilith's diplomatic identity, and spent the rest of the day planning their approach. The hub operated on standard business hours with minimal overnight staffing, making a late evening entry their best option. Security would be lighter, but any unusual activity would also stand out more starkly. "We go in during shift change," Sarilith decided, reviewing the staffing schedules she'd memorized during her time in the foreign ministry. 20:00 hours when day staff is leaving and night staff is arriving. Maximum confusion, minimum attention on any individual person. "And we're going in as what? Contractors, lost tourists?" "I'm going in as a mid-level diplomat conducting routine verification of communication protocols, which is actually something my position would authorize. You're my technical consultant brought in to review linguistic database integrations." She looked at him seriously. "The key is confidence. We belong there, we have authorization, and anyone who questions us is interfering with diplomatic business. Can you project that?" Daniel thought about 4 years of trying to be invisible. "I can try. Confidence isn't exactly my natural state. You stepped between fighting students at Academy. You stood your ground when you were terrified. You can project confidence for one evening. At 19, 45 hours they approached the communication hub. Daniel wore the most professional clothing he owned, which still looked somewhat rumpled compared to Saralith's diplomatic attire, but hopefully read as technical consultant who prioritizes function over form. Saralith moved with the natural authority of someone who'd spent years navigating political spaces, and Daniel tried to mirror her confidence. The security checkpoint at the entrance was their first test. Saralith presented her credentials, suspended, but the frontline security wouldn't necessarily know that yet, and explained they were conducting a routine verification that had been scheduled weeks ago. The security officer looked skeptical but not alarmed, checking their credentials against his database. "I'm not showing a scheduled verification," he said, "because it's logged under administrative protocols, not public scheduling," Saralith replied with just a hint of impatience, like this was a common confusion she dealt with constantly. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, verification code 77 Delta Kappa. "We're already running behind schedule. Are you going to delay diplomatic business over a database categorization issue?" The security officer hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of letting them through against the risk of obstructing someone who might actually have authorization. Saralith's entire bearing screamed, "Diplomat who will make your life difficult if you inconvenience her." "I'll need to verify with my supervisor," he said. "Of course. We'll wait." Saralith's tone suggested she was being remarkably patient about this unnecessary delay. While the security officer moved to consult his supervisor, Daniel felt his heart hammering. This was it. They'd either get through or get arrested. There was no middle ground. The supervisor appeared, an older human woman with the tired expression of someone working a job she'd long since stopped finding interesting. She looked at Saralith's credentials, looked at Saralith herself, and seemed to make a calculation. "Verification code 77 Delta Kappa." "Correct." The supervisor pulled up something on her terminal, frowned, then shrugged. "I've got a notation for diplomatic access under that code. Weird that it's not in the main schedule, but that's above my clearance level to question. You're cleared for entry, but you'll need to stay in authorized zones. Your consultant needs to remain with you at all times." "Naturally," Saralith agreed. They were in. Daniel tried not to visibly exhale in relief as they moved through the checkpoint and into the facility proper. The interior was exactly as bland as he'd expected: corporate neutral design, efficient lighting, the quiet hum of servers and data systems doing their invisible work. "That was too easy," Daniel murmured as they navigated toward the server rooms. "Or we got lucky with a supervisor who doesn't get paid enough to care about edge cases," Saralith countered. "Don't question good fortune, just use it." They reached the server room without encountering additional security. Saralith's access codes opened the door, and they stepped into a space filled with floor-to-ceiling server arrays, climate control maintaining optimal temperature, and the subtle white noise of massive data processing happening constantly. Daniel moved to an access terminal and began the extraction process, his fingers moving through commands with the muscle memory of someone who'd spent years working with language databases. He was looking for specific communication patterns, the grammatical markers and linguistic signatures he'd identified in the messages Saralith had brought to him. "How long?" Saralith asked, standing guard by the door. 10 minutes minimum to run the search protocols. 20 if their system architecture is non-standard. Daniel worked steadily, ignoring the voice in his head screaming that they were committing what was probably several felonies and definitely about to get caught. 8 minutes in, Saralith tensed. "Someone's coming. I need more time." The door opened, and Commander Thrace walked in. Daniel recognized him immediately, Crethian, 3 years ahead of them at Academy, now wearing Concordance intelligence insignia. Thrace's expression cycled through surprise, recognition, and hardening suspicion in rapid succession. "Saralith." Thrace's hand moved toward his sidearm. You're supposed to be under protective observation on Velkari Prime. What are you doing accessing classified communication servers? Thrace, wait, Sarilith began. And Casper, the translator. Thrace looked genuinely confused now. What is this, corporate espionage, political? Who are you working for? We're not working for anyone, Daniel said, his voice steadier than he felt. We're trying to prevent a war by illegally accessing Concordance communication servers. By gathering evidence of a conspiracy to sabotage the summit, Sarilith said quickly. Thrace, I know how this looks, but I have proof that elements of multiple governments are planning to trigger conflict between humanity and the Crethian Alliance. I tried reporting it through official channels and was silenced. We're here because this facility has the complete communication records that prove the conspiracy. Thrace's expression was skeptical, but not immediately dismissive. That's an extraordinary claim. I can prove it, Daniel said. Give me 5 minutes to finish this extraction, and I'll show you linguistic patterns in supposedly unrelated communications that demonstrate coordination between conspirators across species lines. I've already identified 15 probable members using grammatical analysis of encrypted messages. This server has the complete records that will prove the network. You want me to let you continue committing what is definitely a crime, based on a promise that you'll show me evidence of a larger crime? Thrace said flatly. Yes, Sarilith and Daniel said simultaneously. Thrace studied them both, his Crethian features unreadable. Then he moved to the terminal beside Daniel. Show me what you have so far. Daniel pulled up the analysis he'd done from Sarilith's initial data. The grammatical markers, the linguistic patterns, the way certain phrases identified communications from specific sources despite attempts at anonymization. He walked Thrace through it, explaining how human linguistic analysis could identify patterns that automated systems missed because they relied on probabilistic matching rather than deep structural understanding. This marker here, Daniel pointed at a specific construction, appears in 12 messages from supposedly different sources, all discussing resource allocations near disputed space. That's not coincidence. That's someone using the same linguistic fingerprint across multiple identities. And if you map these messages against the diplomatic calendar, he pulled up a timeline. They correlate exactly with key preparation meetings for the summit. Thrace examined the data, his expression shifting from skepticism to concerned focus. This is compelling preliminary evidence, but it's not proof. You're asking me to believe in a massive conspiracy based on grammar analysis. I'm asking you to let me finish the extraction so we can provide complete proof, Daniel said. Or you can arrest us now and hope your superiors aren't part of the conspiracy. Your choice. It was possibly the boldest thing Daniel had ever said to someone who could absolutely ruin his life. But Sarilith had told him he was brave when it mattered, and maybe she was right. Thrace made a decision. Finish the extraction, but I'm staying here, and if this turns out to be anything other than what you're claiming, you're both going to spend a very long time in very small cells. Daniel returned to his terminal, his hands shaking slightly but still functional. He completed the extraction, pulling complete communication records for the last 6 months from the server. The data volume was massive, millions of messages routed through this hub. But with the linguistic markers he'd identified, he could filter them, trace patterns, build a network map of the conspiracy. It took another 15 minutes. Thrace watched in silence while Sarilith provided political context for the names and positions that began appearing in Daniel's analysis. By the time Daniel finished, they had a comprehensive map of the conspiracy. 47 individuals across Velkari, human and Crethian governments, all coordinating to sabotage the summit and trigger human-Crethian conflict. Thrace stared at the data. This is worse than you said. This isn't just sabotage. They're planning actual assassinations of multiple species leaders. Which is why we need to act now, Sarilith said. The summit is in 3 weeks. It's been moved up, Thrace interrupted. Security concerns, it's happening tomorrow, 2 weeks early. The three of them stared at each other, the implications sinking in. Then we're out of time, Daniel said. Whatever they're planning, it happens tomorrow. Thrace made another command decision. Come with me. We're taking this directly to Concordance Intelligence Command. If this conspiracy is real, they need to know immediately. If it's not. He looked at them both. Then you'll face consequences. But given what you've shown me, I think the risk of ignoring this is greater than the risk of investigating it. They followed Thrace through the facility and to a secure transport that took them to intelligence headquarters. A facility Daniel had never been anywhere near and hoped never to visit again after this. The next 6 hours were a blur of briefings, interrogations, and Daniel explaining linguistic analysis to intelligence officers who seemed equally fascinated and skeptical that grammar could be used for counterintelligence. But the evidence was compelling. Cross-referenced with intelligence's own surveillance data, Daniel's linguistic analysis identified communication patterns they'd missed. The conspiracy was real, it was extensive, and it was accelerating its timeline. Intelligence moved fast once they accepted the threat. Key conspirators were identified for surveillance and arrest. Summit security was enhanced. Communication channels were monitored for the specific linguistic markers Daniel had identified. Daniel spent hours at intelligence terminals, analyzing real-time intercepts, identifying coded messages from conspirators trying to coordinate despite the increased security. It wasn't dramatic work, just him staring at screens, running pattern analysis, flagging suspicious communications for intelligence officers to investigate. But Sarilith, watching from beside him, recognized what he might not. Every conspirator he helped identify was one who couldn't complete their part of the sabotage. By dawn, intelligence had arrested 32 conspirators across multiple species. The assassination plot was disrupted. The summit would proceed with enhanced security, but without the planned sabotage. Daniel sat at his terminal, exhausted and running on adrenaline and approximately 7 cups of terrible intelligence facility coffee, and tried to process that maybe they'd actually done it. Maybe they'd actually prevented a war. Thrace found them in the analysis room where they'd been working all night. The summit is secure. We've neutralized the immediate threat. There are still conspirators we haven't identified, but without their coordination network, they can't execute the planned attack. He looked at Daniel and Sarilith with something that might have been respect. You two prevented what intelligence estimates would have been a war costing tens of thousands of lives minimum, probably more. We just did what needed doing, Sarilith said quietly. Most people don't. Most people look away or convince themselves it's not their problem or decide they're not capable of making a difference. Thrace extended his hand, a human gesture he'd likely learned at Academy. Thank you, both of you. They were offered commendations, public recognition, all the formal acknowledgement that came with preventing interstellar incidents. Daniel declined most of it, accepting only a quiet consultation contract with intelligence that would let him occasionally help with linguistic analysis without completely disrupting his normal life. Sarilith, her name cleared and her position restored, chose to step away from diplomatic service. She'd spent years maintaining systems she didn't believe in, and she was done. 3 months later, Daniel was back in his new Seattle apartment, his life having returned to something approximating normal, except for the occasional intelligence contract that paid better than commercial translation work. And except for Sarilith, who'd relocated to Earth and made clear that seeing Daniel wasn't just convenience but priority. She was in his kitchen now, attempting to help him cook pasta despite having no practical experience with human cuisine. Her diplomatic training hadn't covered how not to burn water, and Daniel was discovering that watching her try to figure out Earth cooking implements was both endearing and slightly concerning for his kitchen's safety. This seems inefficient, Sarilith observed, stirring the pasta with uncertain movements. Valkyrie food preparation is mostly automated. Humans like doing things the complicated way. Builds character. Daniel was working on the sauce, which was going slightly better than Saralith's pasta situation. Also, we're kind of stubborn about maintaining traditional skills even when better technology exists. I've noticed you spent years learning languages the hard way when neural implants would have been faster. And because I learned the hard way, I can see patterns that implants miss. Sometimes inefficient is just different, not worse. Saralith's markings brightened. She'd learned that meant she was genuinely happy, not just performing politeness. Do you regret it? Getting involved with the conspiracy, putting yourself in danger? Daniel considered while stirring sauce. I was terrified the entire time. I'm still not entirely sure I was actually helpful or just lucky to have skills that happened to match the need. But no, I don't regret it, because it taught me something important. What? That being unremarkable by one standard doesn't mean you're unremarkable by all standards. Academy measured worth through abilities I'd never have, natural talents, physical advantages, intuitive capabilities. I spent 4 years feeling inadequate because I compared myself to metrics designed for people fundamentally different from me. But preventing that conspiracy required exactly the skills I have. Detailed linguistic analysis, pattern recognition, the ability to explain complex information clearly. Turns out that's remarkable enough when it matters. He glanced at her, found her watching him with those amber eyes that had noticed him 15 years ago even, when he thought he was invisible. And it brought you back into my life. Someone who sees me clearly and chooses to be here. That's worth all the terror. Saralith moved closer, abandoning the pasta she'd been uncertainly stirring. Her markings brightened to nearly full luminescence, joy and affection and something deeper they were both still learning to name. Daniel Casper, you are remarkable. You just needed someone to look at you clearly enough to see it. He kissed her then, because words felt insufficient, and because he'd spent 15 years thinking he was invisible to her, and he was done wasting time. It was slightly awkward because they were different species, and he wasn't naturally smooth at romantic gestures. But it was honest and wanted. When they broke apart, the pasta was overcooked and the sauce needed attention, and the kitchen was becoming a minor disaster zone. I noticed you at Academy, Saralith said softly. I was just too much of a coward to do anything about it. I won't make that mistake again. Good, Daniel replied. Because I spent 15 years thinking I was nobody to you. I'd like to spend the next 15 years proving that wrong. They ate slightly burnt pasta and laughed about the absurdity of their journey. From Academy invisibility to conspiracy investigation, to whatever their relationship was becoming. Daniel's apartment was still modest, his life still quiet by most measures, but it was full in ways it had never been. He'd learned he was never actually weak, just surrounded by people who measured strength in ways that didn't account for his particular forms of brilliance. And now, with Saralith beside him building something real from years of missed connection, he understood something fundamental. Being noticed by the right person matters more than being remarkable to everyone. The galaxy was vast, filled with beings stronger and faster and more naturally gifted than any human. But when it came to seeing patterns others missed, speaking truth that needed hearing, and continuing despite fear, Daniel was exactly remarkable enough. And that, he'd finally learned, was more than sufficient. Sometimes the weak nerd no one noticed becomes exactly the person needed when crisis strikes. Sometimes the skills dismissed as unremarkable turn out to be crucial. And sometimes, 15 years late, the girl who secretly admired you finds the courage to admit it. Daniel had spent years believing he didn't matter. Now he knew better. Worth isn't determined by how you measure against people fundamentally different from you. It's determined by what you choose to do with what you actually have. And what he had, linguistic brilliance, pattern recognition, stubborn determination, and compassionate courage, turned out to be exactly what was needed. not just to prevent a war, but to build a life worth living with someone who saw him clearly and chose him anyway. That was